Je vais avoir 2-3 questions après, notamment sur le travail des levures et tout ça. On va juste peut-être faire un contrepoint avec you, Thomas. Le fait d'appeler cette petite sous-partie millésime parfait, c'est évidemment provocateur, hein, parce que c'est sans doute un mot qui ne s'applique plus et qui n'est pas du tout pertinent pour parler de ça. Une fois encore, c'est comment est-ce que sur des millésimes, après des apprentissages compliqués, 17, 18, 19, comment est-ce qu'on peut arriver à agir de nouveau et pas juste à réagir sur un travail pour amener quelque chose avec une volonté de faire un profil de vin avec une sensibilité unique. You, Thomas, you have another difficulties also where you are, and something that we don't know here yet, which is fire, donc les feux. How do you work today for the same thing, like with a vintage? At the end, you probably never had 2 vintage in a row that were similar. You had always something different to deal with. And how do you apprehend that and still kind of give yourself some freedom or a will to continue to improve and progress to make these cuvées that you can see being a cuvée de garde and kind of your flagship? So can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges and the positive where you are and how you dealt with this wine that is quite different from the one we tasted this morning?
Yes. Okay, so I want to, Ludwig spoke about, and Pascaline went through the last 10 years or so in Montlouis of the frosts and how they have affected each of the seasons and mentioning primary bud loss. So for us, that has not been a problem at all until this year. And this was the first year that we have had that problem. And this is mostly because of the weather pattern that we get, that we are still getting air from the Gulf of Alaska that goes over the Pacific Northwest, and it creates a delayed spring. So most spring, we get another 3, 4, sometimes 5 weeks of cooling weather, and that allows the bud break to occur and for the plant to start its growth season without much risk of frost. So the other part of that being is the trouble that has been here in many areas in France. Well, what's causing that is early start of season and then cold weather returning. That's the change. It's not that we're colder later, it's that we're starting earlier. And now that's a new phenomena for us too. This year we had very, very warm or mild, but warm for us, February, March, very little rain. And then poof, vine starts, and the entire month of April, cold. We had snow. We had rain almost every day for the entire month. And so we lost somewhere between 50 and 90% of primary bud to frost because we are not prepared to deal with that in most of the vineyard. There are some that have, microclimate where it happens more, but not for the Chenin vineyard and not for most of our vineyard. So I just wanted to say that the frost has not been really the issue that we've had. We've had more issue from the middle season on, and especially in the last 5 years. And this has been because it is so much warmer and so much drier in the summer months that there are fires that occur in the forests that are not maybe next to the vineyard, but 100, 200 kilometers away. And the winds carry the smokes into the vineyard. Well, 2020 was, to go to this vintage, was very complex to begin with. Okay, so we typically try to prune quite late and to limit the amount of time that there is cut on the vine before the season starts. And so we make the pruning in early March. And 1 week later, everything shut down for COVID. So it was very difficult with the crew. That some people we didn't want to work. We weren't sure if it was safe. And so we start the season, and thankfully we have very little problems, and we thin the buds, the shoots, and off we go. Season starts. It's warm, but not too hot, but very warm and pleasant through the summer months. And then the first week of September, we typically have wind that brings the marine air from the Pacific Ocean and layers over the Northwest. And that reversed on like 3rd or 4th of September, and very hot air from the desert pushed into the vineyard lands all over the Northwest and into California too. And so more fires than any of us have ever seen, by far. And much closer to the vineyards, so the skies were just like orange. It was crazy. And it stayed like that for 10 days. So we learned a lot about smoke and fire this particular vintage, but not all smoke is the same. The source of what is burning, the proximity to the vineyard, how ripe your grapes are, how long the smoke has been inundated in the site, all of these things factor into how it affects the grape. And so, like us, many vignerons were having so many questions. Do we pick? Do we not? Do we just say, oh, no, this vintage is done? And we're trying to send samples of our grapes to laboratories in far off places that have the means to be able to analyze the grapes and tell us what is inside of them. Well, they only have, up until, there is more now, but at this point there was only 2 markers that could be measured within them, and the compounds are guaiacol and methyl guaiacol. So for anybody who loves Syrah, guaiacol is naturally in high concentration in Syrah grapes. So the smoky flavor, is partially from that. But it's not typical of Chenin, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Gamay, the grapes that we focus on. And so we get the results back and numbers are like through the roof. I mean, crazy high. And so we're trying to figure out how we make the picking decisions. So before, I told you from the vintage we tried before, from 2018, which was very ideal, we went and made 2 passes through the vines, and we picked the ripeness at one point and then come back over 15 days later and we pick some more. This year, we just try to get it off as quick as we can, as soon as it's safe. And so we had to wait until the smoke cleared and for there to pull the team together to be able to, and we pick everything at once. And I say to you before, we make this Cours de Cuvée and we take the nice juice from the middle of the press. So this year, everything must go into a tank first. And what we learned very quickly is that most of the compounds of smoke are in the skin, and so we need to settle the material as much as we possibly can. So into tank, cold jacket on, settle hard, clarify it so that we have very little, it almost looked like a finished wine, it was so clear. Rack it, do it again, and keep it cold and prevent fermentation from occurring. After we did that 3 times, we keep the fine lees from the prior vintage. So we use this typically as a nutrition aid for the next vintage, because the yeast hulls, the dead cells, are a good nutrition resource for plots that have maybe low nitrogen or other micronutrient challenges. And so we keep them, and instead of using them for nutrition this year, we use them as a flocculant to put suspension back into the clarified juice so that the levure have something to hold on to. And so that we have aléas for aging once the wine in barrel. So this was a far different approach than we'd ever done, and but it worked. So the wine, what we had learned was to ferment warm was important. So we usually ferment like Ludovic at 15 to 17 degrees Celsius, but this year we fermented at 20 degrees Celsius. And to make the fermentation go much quicker, it ends up, the reasoning is to increase fruitiness in the wine and to be able to make the decision if another racking is necessary to get off of lees again. And then to shorten the élevage. For the same reasons, we have to preserve what fruitiness we can. These were the ways that we could find to work with this without using chemical or mechanical. So there's charcoal, carbon is a chemical way, or with reverse osmosis. And we wanted to avoid those processes. And so 2020, a wine that is very different, but from the very same place. And we still feel like it tastes like it's from that site, and it has its character of its vintage, but it isn't what we thought we would do even 2 weeks before we harvested. So, voila.
This is a thing. Je vais parler en français. Voilà, c'est des conditions qu'on ne connaît pas forcément nous-mêmes d'un point de vue de l'autre côté de la barrière. Une fois, merci encore de votre transparence à tous les deux par rapport à ces réflexions-là, parce que nous présente toujours les vins comme étant presque magiquement faits, et de comprendre derrière la réflexion et la réaction sur si peu de temps pour sauver une vendange, comprendre comment travaillent les raisins et surtout continuer avec certains protocoles aussi de vinification, c'est-à-dire ne pas utiliser certains produits et ou aides pour garder une éthique de travail sur ces vins. En quelques jours, il fallait vraiment savoir que les feux étaient vraiment à côté, qu'il avait fallu évacuer les villes. Enfin, c'était vraiment une ambiance apocalyptique. Hein. C'était beaucoup de personnes qui sont décédées dans ces feux. Donc c'est vraiment... je pense que merci encore d'être aussi transparent par rapport à tout ça, et surtout quand vous goûtez le résultat final et le vin. Moi, je suis de plus en plus en demande par rapport aux vignerons sur vraiment une transparence, même les difficultés, parce que ça nous aide vraiment à comprendre aussi ce qu'il y a dans la bouteille et pas avoir des jugements trop hâtifs quand on ne comprend pas. Et quand on voit un résultat comme ça, je trouve ça vraiment admirable quand on voit le travail derrière.
It's actually very surprising to hear, to taste the wine after hearing this, and there's absolutely no trace of smoke taint. We do taste a lot of wines that have some. You said that you put everything in. You didn't have that cœur de presse as you usually do. Is it something you fear for the future? Is what you did enough to get away in every vintage? Or because just like climate, the fires will also be very different every time, will have a different impact. Do you think this is something you're going to have to reinvent every year? That this technique is not something that can be carried forward for every case of fire?
Well, it's a great question. And so, for better or worse, in 2020, we make wine from 24 different parcels spread amongst about 200 kilometers circle. So we had wines that were every single vineyard, all 25 had the impact of wildfire that year, but each one was a different source fire with different proximities, different material that was causing the burns, and different lengths of time. So we had to make a lot of experiment in 2020. Many of my peers chose not to pick that year, especially with the red grapes, because the skin contact necessity meant that there was higher likelihood of problems. We made the decision that this is now, it's not the future. Climate change is affecting us now.